Dustin works with AAD Inspection Corp, and he is one of my favorite inspectors there. They all do a great job. The company is very thorough. It offers, they really stand behind their work. And I sell to a lot of out-of-state investors as well as in-state investors and homeowners. But my theory is I'd rather have an inspector who's going to find more information than somebody wants to know, even if it threatens to overwhelm them and kill a deal, than to have someone be surprised down the road. And I've worked with a ton of inspectors, and no one as consistently as Dustin and the team in AAD is able to provide the most reliable and thorough information with the bonuses that come along with it, the guarantee, the phone calls, the re-inspections. So Dustin, help us learn the things that you're always seeing in inspections, the repeat offenders, and how the things that we can look at when we're evaluating a property for purchase the first time we walk through. A lot of times I'm remembering all these things that you're running through, or an asset manager when they're going through their rental or asking their manager to go through their rental, or an asset manager when they're, someone who's got a property manager, but they drive by their rental, or a property manager doing walkthroughs. This is where I think this information here is going to be relevant. Take it away.
I look at it from both perspectives. But I suppose first I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Dustin Nicholas with AAD Inspection, and I have been doing commercial and residential inspections in the Treasure Valley for about 10 years. So I have had the opportunity to see a lot of different properties, and the opportunity to see the same problem over and over again. So we have kind of a list here that we can pop through real quick, and we'll look at it, like you said, Stacy, from both perspectives, as an inspection that you might be doing annually, biannually, quarterly, or even as an initial approach on a property. But if we're starting kind of on the outside, there are a lot of really little things that in the long term can cause pretty significant damages, but are relatively easy to take care of up front. So I think the first thing that we have on the list is specific to tree branches. When you're approaching a property and you see branches touching any part of the roofing, siding, fascia, trees always look really nice. Plantings look really great up close to a property. Sometimes they cover imperfections. But one thing that they do is they really hold moisture against the home. Any aspect of the home that they're touching, they can hold on to moisture. And what that does is over time, it can lead to accelerated degradation of paint, rot in siding surfaces, especially if they're cellulose-based, wood-based. But even masonry surfaces, when you hold moisture against masonry, that allows moisture transfer through, which can damage portions of the interior of the wall. But when you have tree branches, kind of like this picture you see in the slide here, anytime we get a real light wind, or heaven forbid, a really heavy wind, that acts just like sandpaper on the structure. And it's most damaging to shingles, especially if you have a 3-tab shingle, which is pictured in this photo here. Over time, that sandpaper effect will actually wear down the shingles, wear down the underlying roofing felt, and can actually wear down the underlying roof sheathing as well. So a little bit of maintenance yearly, with trimming tree branches out away from the home, at least 1 foot of clearance helps things dry out in between watering and rain cycles, in addition to allowing newer growth in the future without threatening the structure or the plantings itself. So that's a pretty common one that we see pretty often, is the tree branches. But I think the next one we were going to talk about was fiberboard siding.
Yeah, because you did a good job starting with the low-hanging branches.
Sure, thank you. One of the biggest things that I struggle against is not being too long-winded with my explanations. So I'll try to keep them as short as I can, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions if there are as we go, or if we want to ask and answer some questions towards the end. But the next one is the fiberboard siding, and especially the bottom edges. Now, fiberboard siding is compressed cellulose. It's a wood-based type material. It's very similar to cardboard, but it's really a great siding type. It's painted well. One of the things that we don't see in the valley, in new construction and almost any existing home, is paint on the very bottom edges of the siding and trim. Those cellulose-based materials, once they get wet, they swell, and they'll never go back to the size and shape that they were originally. And continuous wetting of these bottom edges can actually lead to moisture wicking of water up into the siding surfaces that can eventually lead to damages in the wall and the substrate behind it. Any homeowner, any property owner, to take a little bit of time to paint those very bottom edges of the siding and trim, even if it's just primer, can help protect against that continued future wetting of those surfaces that can lead to damages. If you can imagine a tenant in a property who maybe is controlling their own irrigation water or is not paying close attention, but if you have a sprinkler that's spraying underneath the siding, if it does that 30 minutes per station, perhaps 3 to 5 days a week, 4 to 6 months out of the year, if not longer, for a long period of time, that can lead to some pretty serious damage. So a little bit of extra money in paint up front, or if you notice paint starting to wear in those edges, can really save some heartache in the future when it comes
Dustin,
to
you've taught me to ask the painters to do this, because through
yes.
listing prep, there's a lot of times there's these exterior paint jobs, and even when we're painting it to sell, it's almost a point of principle at this time, where I'm like, can you please paint the bottom edge? And the painters, they hate doing it because it messes up your paintbrush.
Yeah.
So they'll want to use those more of a disposable paintbrush for that, because no matter how well they prep the surface, there's still going to be, it's going to be not
pretty
a
rough
surface. Yeah.
So, very few painters in the Valley want to do that, and they just flat out don't unless you specifically contract them for it. So sometimes it does cost a little bit of extra money. But, if you ever have time on a Saturday, it might take an hour, a couple of really cheap paint brushes, and just a single gallon of paint primer. You can touch those up all the way around. You get a little piece of cardboard. You can slide it up underneath the siding to protect the foundation from paint, so you don't get any unusual discolorations. And then, of course, not just the fiberboard siding, but the hardy plank siding, which is cementitious concrete board. That's kind of touted as one of the more indestructible materials. But even concrete board, though it does not swell, it still absorbs water up into wall surfaces that can cause damages. So that paint's really important.
So wood siding, fiberboard siding, concrete board, anything but vinyl siding, we need to make sure that bottom edge is painted, huh?
Yes, anything but vinyl, stucco, or any type of masonry, but everything else, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, this one comes up a lot.
Yeah, negative grading. So that's a big one. When we first excavate foundation footing areas to cast in concrete footings and stem walls, we always dig that soil out and then just push it right back in when we're done. In a perfect world, we push it in a few inches at a time, compact it real well, so that by the time we have our finished grading, it's compacted at a 99%, so it's not going to drop over time. But you take that really loose fill dirt that's not compacted very well after construction, and 3 or 4 years later, we have kind of these big slopes back towards the foundation that always captures surface water. So if we have a lot of heavy rains, any type of negative grading that can funnel water towards the foundation runs the risk of putting water up against a concrete surface that is porous. Concrete is not waterproof, no matter how much we try to waterproof it, and especially older homes, before we did waterproof foundations, anytime you have water against that concrete, eventually it will make its way to the other side. If you have a crawl space, that runs the risk of putting moisture into the crawl spaces, which can raise relative humidity, leading to humidity-related problems such as mold or mildew. But even when you have a slab-on-grade concrete floor, just like this picture here, but even when you have a slab-on-grade concrete floor in the home, any moisture transfer through the foundation starts to create voids and pockets under the interior slab. So continuous wetting can actually lead to settling of interior concrete slab surfaces as well. But it's one of those things, it's real simple. We can bring a little bit of dirt in, bring that soil level up. And I don't know if we have a picture of any kind of grass growing against the foundation. I don't think so. But when you walk a home that has grass planted all the way up to the concrete, you know that you're just holding water against the foundation, especially if it's nice and green grass. So that's one of those things that it's real simple to pay attention to. But in the long term, if you don't adjust that grading, pull the grass away, move the sprinklers away, eventually you can find you get a lot of water in the crawl spaces. And once we start dealing with mold and mildew, things can get expensive in the repair later on.
And it's amazing to me that the builders, I know CVH has built a ton of homes in the Valley over the years, and all their homes of a certain era always have the sprinkler heads right next to the foundation.
Right up against the foundation. Yeah. And again, just like with the fiberboard siding, if you can imagine, just sprinkler water spraying across the foundation over the course of years, you saturate those soils so much, you can actually lead to settling of those soils and moisture transfer into the crawl spaces. And
We have a
that's
picture of that coming up too.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
That's even more of a concern when you have pressurized irrigation. As you get into places like Cuna, Nampa, Caldwell, Melba, some of the farm municipalities as we get further out from Boise and Meridian that have pressurized irrigation, especially if you allow tenant control of the irrigation water. A lot of folks will equate green grass to more water, not so much green grass to the way you take care of it, such as fertilizers and things like that. So a lot of pressurized irrigation I see where the sprinkler timing is 45 minutes to an hour and a half per station, sometimes 2 days a week, or excuse me, 2 times a day, 7 days a week. And if you can just imagine the amount of thousands of gallons of water that you're putting up against the foundation. So just being real conscious of negative grading, irrigation water, and anything that can allow moisture to set against a concrete foundation.
Including unextended gutters.
Yes, that's another one. When you have gutters that come down against the foundation, especially when there's negative grading there, you tend to get a lot of moisture buildup around those gutter discharge elbows. Gutters are not required, so we kind of pick our poison when we install them. We can take all the watershed around the roof and discharge it into a relatively uniform area all the way around. But that does put water in every foundation location, or we decide to put gutters up and then we discharge that water into very concentrated areas in 3 or 4 places. So another real, and I'm glad you brought that up, another real simple way to prevent that moisture pooling against the foundation is splash blocks and or gutter downspout extensions. You can buy those 4-foot extensions for $10 to $15, put them on your gutter downspouts, and then we don't have to worry about so much of that water coming back towards the foundation. So just real minor things that help prevent issues like this one here with water in the crawl spaces like that.
And I don't think any of the property managers really make it a habit of looking in the crawl spaces during their annual inspections. I think First Rate will poke their head down there.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's something that hasn't been done as an owner for a long time, or if you have that that fortunate misfortune of free water, it might be worthwhile checking it out down there once in a while. It wouldn't be the first time I've gone to list a house and we've checked it out pre-listing and gone, oh, surprise, there's the kind of swimming pool in the crawl space that we don't get to charge extra for.
Absolutely. And I do represent a lot of property investors where they will actually employ us to come out once or twice a year to poke our heads in the attics or the crawl spaces. I think as we get further in the list, I have a couple of examples where that type of annual, biannual, just a quick peek down below and up above can really save some energy and money and remediation down the road.
Which service of AADs is that?
We call it a walk and talk. It does not come with any kind of report. It's $195 for the first hour. But what that does is allows us about an hour's worth of time to go through the exterior foundations, attic interiors, crawl space interiors, the roof, the major mechanical systems. And of course, while we're there for that hour, we run water through all the traps, fixtures, sinks, and faucets. It gives us the opportunity to look for any kind of leaks in the plumbing that either might be in ceiling surfaces, wall surfaces, or especially down in the crawl spaces. It's just a real quick look for any kind of major concerns that might not otherwise be seen on a quick property evaluation where you would be walking through and just looking at the general, real visible conditions. But those places that are often out of sight, out of mind, we just don't get a real close eye on. So.
And they also offer a pre-listing inspection too.
Yes.
So there's a couple renditions of that where you can get a kind of a inspection light where we can find out if there's any hurdles or issues to overcome or anything damaging the home.
It might be a concern when you go to list, if you've had a tenant in a property for a long time and, we want to see if there's anything real big, that service is excellent. HVAC maintenance, that's my favorite one to talk about. In tenant-owned properties, I can't tell you how many filters I've seen that look to be older than I am. I've always been a big fan of your yearly, biannually, and quarterly evaluations of HVAC equipment. Those 1-inch furnace filters have a typical life of about 3 months. The 2-inch filters have a typical life of about 6 months. And then the 4-inch filters have a life of up to 12 months. So HVAC plans, and I know we talked about this earlier, Stacy, first rate, where they mail out filters, and then you have somebody walk the property. You can check to see if those filters have been installed or not. But if you have a 3-month 1-inch filter, and maybe you go out twice a year and you see that it's dirty, you can replace it or have them replace it at that time. But if you don't view or employ somebody to view the furnace maintenance to check those types of filters, 3-4 years down the road, when they're just so clogged that airflow cannot pass through them any longer, you start to run the risk of damaging the furnace blower. You start to run the risk of not being able to put enough air across the heat exchanger, which in a typical HVAC system should have a life of 12 to 17 or 18 years. And even 25 to 30 years when they're really maintained. You can significantly reduce that overall life if you end up with a crack in a heat exchanger because not enough airflow, not enough filter maintenance, too much dirt buildup on the heat exchanger metal itself. That's almost always a death sentence for your HVAC equipment. So, a couple of $10 or $12 filters and a little bit of eyes and years on the system, you don't have to worry about so much spending that $6,000 to $8,000 more often than you really need to replace an HVAC equipment system. So,
And property investors are really good at avoiding being nickel and dimed, but I think in this case, there's some nickels and dimes that are well spent. If there's a furnace filter program that your property manager offers, some of them, they sign the tenants up. Some of them are mandatory. Some of them the owners pay for. I think First Rate has one where they ship the filters off every few months to the tenants, and so then those filters are just arriving. Now that doesn't mean that anyone's standing there making sure that they change them, but then they'll notice on their annual walkthrough inspections if there's too many filters just sitting there unused. I think that's a good service to spring for when possible.
another thing that you want to keep an eye on as far as mechanical equipment goes in our list here is water heaters. There's not a lot of annual maintenance that you can perform on a water heater other than really just making sure that it's not making percolation sounds, that the catch pan around its base is not wet. Sometimes it doesn't hurt to pull the burner compartment cover off to see if there's any rust colored stains. Electric water heaters have a very long life expectancy, 30 to 40 years in some instances. They just have the 2 element replaceable parts, but natural gas water heaters are much more common because natural gas is cheaper. But they have a much shorter life expectancy, again, that 12 to 17 year mark. When a natural gas water heater fails, it will fail from the weld seam around its base. You have so many years of heating, cooling, expanding, contracting of that metal that when it fails, it will burst its seams. Now, it doesn't always go all at once. In fact, most often it goes slowly. So you might get a small hole in the weld seam and a little bit of water will leak through it. Sometimes it'll even rust back together so that it's sealed. But that does denote that the weld seam around the base is becoming weak. Another thing that you can pay attention to is if you're ever running hot water and you're listening to your water heater, if it makes those percolation sounds, kind of like a coffee maker would, that means that we're starting to build up sediment at the bottom of the water heater that requires the burner to work much harder to heat the water inside the heating tank. If it has to overheat the metal at the base to heat the water in it because we've got sediment buildup, we really run the risk of accelerating the wear in the weld seam around the bottom of the water heater. Obviously, you're not always going to be there to put eyes on the water heater or ears on the water heater. So they do make water sensors and water alarms, just little pads that you would place around the base of a water heater or even a clothes washer dryer or a dishwasher, that if water touches those pads, it'll send an alarm sensor to go off, and it'll actually make a really loud, annoying sound that you would hope if a tenant hears that, they would report it to somebody that says, hey, there's water here. And those are fairly inexpensive to have installed. You just pick them up at Lowe's or Home Depot. But
I had
that's
to send my father-in-law one because I was the water heater is in their guest room closet, in his guest room closet, and I've heard you talk about percolating sounds from all these inspections. And I was like, wait, what's that sound I hear? And I'm investigating the closet and it was making some percolation sounds. It's an electric water heater. And I wasn't sure what the action to take. So we just got him one of those water alarms for now.
Perfect. It's always helpful because they start so slow, but they can become such a big problem later on. Excuse
Did
me.
you
And
get it flushed out as well?
yes, that was the next thing. You can actually hire a plumber or a handyman if you're comfortable with it, or even yourself if you do any of your own self-managing. But you can flush the sediment out of a water heater just with a simple hose. Turn the water heater off, let the water flow out, open the valve at the bottom, and you can just run the water out into the grass somewhere. And the pressure of the water coming into the water heater will push a lot of that sediment out. If you go too long without flushing the water heater, though, if there's too much sediment, it can clog that discharge, and then it gets a little bit difficult. And that's where a plumber would be a little bit more helpful. But a little bit of maintenance goes a long ways.
Great. Well, and in terms of maintenance, I know another thing that we never really think about are those dryer vents, but those are also one of the bigger causes of fires, I believe, dryer vents and lint
They are.
buildup.
One of the leading causes of home fires is dryer vents. Dryer lint is just so flammable. One thing that we see is a real common recommendation from dryer vent cleaners is at least one yearly dryer vent clean. It's unfortunate, but the maximum distance that a dryer vent is allowed to discharge is only 25 feet. You have a 5-foot reduction for every 90-degree elbow bend in the dryer vent line. So if you can imagine a dryer vent going into a crawl space with a 90-degree elbow that then runs vertically another 10 or 15 feet with a 90-degree elbow to come up, and then a third 90-degree elbow to go out the dryer, the foundation exhaust vent, that's 3 5-foot reductions. So now all of a sudden you can only go 10 feet. And it's very common to see a full 25-foot run with 3 or 4 of those 90-degree elbows. And each of those elbows runs the risk of capturing dryer lint. So it's really important to pull the dryer out, auger that lint out often. And like you see in the picture here, when you have a dryer vent that runs up through the roof, there's not always enough airflow to push lint up and out. So it's actually more important when they run up through the roof the way this one does to have them clean more often. But one thing that happens if you don't get those cleaned out enough, not only dryer fires, but it starts to produce condensation and humidity. If that humidity cannot be exhausted to the exterior, it will build up in the ducts. And I've gotten into countless crawl spaces where we might have a 20-foot run of dryer vent ducting and water just pouring out of every seam all across the crawl space because years have gone by without cleaning. So that's something that tends to fall off the radar pretty often is lint buildup in the dryer vent ducts. And then of course, if you ever have anyone that owns their own dryer, there are actually 2 lint traps on most dryers, one at the front that you pull open and closed when you're doing your laundry regularly. And then most of them actually have a second lint trap on the backside of the dryer that needs to be cleaned out annually as well, because if that can't dissipate heat, then we run the risk of overheating in the dryer itself. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to dryers. I think the last point I would make when it comes to dryer vents that run through an attic, you can kind of see in the second picture here, is I have gotten into so many attics from the 1980s and prior where we used to use flexible ribbed metal ducting or flexible ribbed plastic ducting that is no longer rated for that type of a use, but it's such a weak material that when it gets clogged by lint, it tends to get really heavy and then they fall from their penetrations through the roof. And then all of a sudden we have an open dryer duct discharging into an attic. And again, if you're not putting eyes in the attic, every 6 months or a year or so, and you're not knowing that something's discharging up into the attic, then I have seen some pretty significant mold development because of dryer vents discharging into the attic. There's just so much humidity pumped into those confined spaces that can't escape. So there's always a little bit to look at there.
It all comes back to water and humidity and moisture for the big expenses.
It really does. And when it comes to any kind of water type damage, humidity type damage, caulking is amazing. Obviously home inspectors are always saying that we don't like to see caulking as any type of permanent repair. But when you're looking at sheet vinyl floors, outside penetrations like in the photo here, a little bit of caulking goes an awful long way. So in regards to sheet vinyl flooring and caulking, and washing machine trays like this one, anywhere where you have a continuous flooring surface that is often water resistant or even waterproof in a lot of vinyl cases, if you don't caulk the perimeter edges of that flooring, if you ever do have a water leak or a water flood of some sort, that water doesn't just sit on the vinyl. It's going to run to some perimeter location where it can then get below the vinyl. And when water becomes trapped between the vinyl flooring and the underlayment below it, which is typically particle board, we see a lot of really significant swelling. Once that swelling occurs and bulges out, particle board, just like fiberboard, will never go back to its original shape. So now you have these big humps and ridges. So a little bit of caulking around those perimeters helps keep the water on top of the floor so it can be noticed and cleaned up. And that's included in laundry stations, refrigerator cubbies, dishwasher stations. You know, if you ever have a dishwasher, you want to always take a look underneath that dishwasher to see if your flooring runs underneath it, or if the vinyl flooring or whatever flooring material you have actually stops at the front of the dishwasher, because that's a perfect location for water to get underneath those floors. So always be sure that your vinyl floors run under the dishwasher. Always make sure that you caulk in and around the dishwasher cubby, the refrigerators, especially when you have ice maker water lines. There's just so many water sources that can cause damage. And then if you have a closed washer dryer, those really cheap trays, and a lot of times you can install them with a little drain that will discharge to the exterior. So if you ever have a leak, you'll notice it. And then you can always put your water sensor or high water alarm in those trays and pans and around those dishwashers to know if you're getting water. But caulking is just so cheap and it goes such a long way. It's one of those things that you want to kind of pay attention to. And even in bathrooms, you know, you see those joints sealed at the bottom of tubs, toilets. Anytime that caulking begins to crack, it's always worth stripping and reapplying,
Now,
especially.
Tony Dross doesn't like to caulk his toilets. He would rather see the water come out so he can find the leak as opposed to run the risk of.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
The caulking often helps secure the toilet in place. If a toilet doesn't secure well on the floor flange gasket and it can rock, we run the risk of depressing the flange gasket and allowing flush water leaks outside of it. So when we suggest caulking around toilets, you'll caulk the two sides and around the front, but you want to leave you know, a 3, 4, 5 inch gap at the very back of the toilet. So like Tony likes to know is if it does leak, it's going to come out on top of the floor somewhere where you're going to see it. So you caulk the sides, the front, you caulk the perimeters of your bathroom. So when that water does get on top of the subflooring, or excuse me, on top of the vinyl flooring, you're going to see it. But yeah, that is dangerous if you caulk all the way around the toilet. If you do have a flush water leak, that water builds up and can't go anywhere but into the flooring between the vinyl and the subflooring, which is usually the particle board underlayment. So
Have you seen with the new LVP flooring that's so popular and that is the wood look luxury vinyl plank? I love it. I'm going to be using more and more of it, but it's not as pliable as vinyl. And so when you get a water leak with vinyl, a lot of times you can see that the vinyl will discolor. With these more durable vinyl surfaces, have you seen that starting to create more secret water leaks underneath the flooring?
I haven't seen a lot of it. Those vinyl plank floors are not waterproof, but they're still water resistant the way they lock together. So as long as you're sealing your perimeters again, and the biggest thing that you're really wanting to do is make sure that you see the water first before it gets underneath or below. A lot of those vinyl planks, some of them don't actually go in over particle board underlayment. They have their own pads, and some of them are installed just flat over just regular OSB flooring. So yeah, we don't have the telltale discoloration, the telltale swelling in the underlayment that tells us that there's water down below it. So that is probably a risk that we see associated with vinyl planking. But again, as long as it's installed correctly by a qualified professional, we caulk all of our perimeters. If we do have a water leak, hopefully we'll see it before it causes damage.
Well, that's the goal.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, here's some damage.
Yeah, fun one. So this one was a replacement. And it just looks like they did not connect this is a drain pan under HVAC equipment in an attic. You know, when we see furnaces in an attic, there is required to be a drain pan underneath the whole furnace if it's a high efficiency furnace, and the evaporator coil if it's a standard 80% furnace where we're only producing condensate from the air conditioning system in the summertime. You always have a primary drain that'll usually discharge water to the exterior, or if it's in an attic like this one near a laundry room, we'll run that discharge for the primary into the laundry drain. Then there's typically a secondary drain that will either discharge water into the catch tray below it, which is this metal pan that we see, or you'll have a safety switch that's intended to shut the whole system down if it begins to overflow water. But if it's set up to allow water to drain into the catch tray beneath it, it's really important that you have your inspections and evaluations to be darn sure that your secondary drain safety for the catch pan is actually connected and is actually sealed well. In this copper, where the copper drain line meets the catch tray, sometimes we don't seal around those very well. So even if the drain is connected and water leaks around it, we can get water over conditioned living spaces. So this is one of those things that I feel like inspections are really important to discover.
New build properties, because sometimes people think they don't need one on a new build, but in this case, the HVAC guy and the plumber, got there at different times, and the plumber, the HVAC guy expected the plumber to come back and make some connections, and it didn't happen.
It never did. Yeah, I can't tell you how many drains I've seen that were just never installed. I've found on new construction home inspections quite often where, say, a master drain isn't connected. That's really nice to find out up front. But I also have quite a few clients that do not do a home inspection on new construction because we kind of have the false thought process that it's brand new, everything's perfect. And then before they're outside of their 1-year warranty, they might have me come in and do a full home inspection to see if there's anything that would be worth bringing up to the builder under the warranty. And it's a real shame to find out that a year later, we've had almost a whole year's worth of sewage in the crawl space because of a disconnect.
Yeah, well, especially since you do offer that 1-year new build warranty re-inspect. So if anyone here gets a new home, what you can do is you can do your inspection, catch something like this up front, and then for my clients, I'll schedule it. I'll make a calendar appointment 10, 11 months out that reminds us to call you back for the 1-year quick look to make sure nothing rattled loose in the past year, no new warranty issues.
We offer that full inspection service and then the free repair inspection that comes along with it. Yeah, we can go through everything with a fine tooth comb up front and then come back almost a year later for free and just make sure everything's still in good shape. And we do the same thing where we'll come through and run water and test all the fixtures and make sure we haven't had any leak developments. Real quick, I'm going to plug in my computer. It's not all the way there. I sure hate to lose you most of the way through this.
Yeah, does anybody here have a rental with a fireplace in it? Because we see them as sometimes, especially in the older homes. The newer homes seems like they're more gas fireplaces, but
yeah, wood burning stoves, open face fireplaces, I've always perceived as a real great risk. So either some of the investors that I work with will abandon them or have clauses in the lease that ask the tenants not to use them, but you can't always really police that. So one thing that you can do is certainly upgrade it to a natural gas fireplace and make sure that you have an insert appliance installed. But if you ever have a fireplace, especially one with a wood burning stove type insert, I don't find it a real great idea to rely on tenants for flue maintenance. Fireplaces that are open faced operate on what we would consider complete combustion. So they do not tend to produce a lot of creosote, even though we run the risk of sparks and embers, carpets, fires that way. But wood burning stoves, where you build a rip-roaring hot fire and then you damper the airflow down to allow the fire and the logs just to kind of smolder enough to keep the metal hot enough to radiate heat out into the home. That process of combustion produces creosote, which you can see in the second photo here, where I'm sure we're all familiar with that, is the black oily substance known to cause chimney fires. If you're using a wood burning stove often in the wintertime, it might be that you have to clean it once a year. So either upgrading to natural gas or employing your own chimney sweeps and inspectors to come out and make sure everything's nice and clean and safe for your tenants. Those are always one thing to be real careful with.
Yeah. And then, I think this is liabilities. They come in many forms. And so when you're doing a drive-by of a rental or any preview of a property, just keeping your eyes out for various liabilities.
Tripping hazards is probably the biggest one that we see, which is your picture here. Any vertical disparity in a walking path exceeding 5/8 of an inch is considered a tripping hazard by most standards. And that doesn't necessarily have to be attendant to the trips. You know, if it's a tripping hazard on a sidewalk in front of the property owner is liable whether they know it's there or not. Um, you know, there are a number of companies, and I know you and Tony use them often enough, but like Greenform Insulation and Concrete Razors of Idaho, that can actually do mortar injections or foam injections to level pads back into position. And that helps keep the nice, clean look without having to grind down. I know a lot of times we'll see where vertical disparity, somebody will get a concrete grinder and grind the top coat off, and then we see this really rough looking aggregate. But I wouldn't say that it's real inexpensive to float concrete, but it's not that expensive. And it certainly beats paying out a lawsuit for somebody that's tripped and broken a bone. So, you know, those things are really, really easy to look for when you're walking up to a property, even driving by.
And something like this would cost, I bet, less than $200
Oh, it'd be really expensive. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what they'll do is they'll just kind of drill holes in that pad, and then they'll inject foam or mortar and just pick the pad right back up. The settling typically occurs either from inadequately compacted soil or perhaps a sprinkler leak where water has actually been able to get in underneath the pad and void some of those pockets. So you have these big air gaps that allow that to move. Sometimes we would consider that frost heaving in the winter, where if you get moisture underneath the pad and then it freezes and picks the pad up, and then when the moisture goes away and the pad drops back down. So what they're really doing is filling those voids that prevent that movement.
And other liabilities might be, you know, smoke detectors. Sometimes those get disabled. We'll catch a lot of disabled smoke detectors. From a landlord perspective, we like to make sure everybody can lock their door and lock their windows. And if window locks get broken, those are worth replacing. GFCI outlets in the kitchen and bathroom, especially if you have an older house where, you know, GFI, those are not that expensive to purchase and worthwhile to install. Just
About $15 a piece, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that provides a lot of safety around water sources, bathrooms, tubs, sinks, toilets, kitchens, garages, for sure.
Yeah, anything exterior. Now, this is a copy of a part of First Rate's checklist of things that they go through. I work with Tony Drost. He's the founder of First Rate Property Management. So they're always very generous in their contributions to AVID. And so you can see here that some of the things that are on the list that we already spoke about, you know, locks, fans, detectors, Nighthawk is a detector, and then other things that prevent damage that they look at. Door stops are easy ways to prevent damage, and toilet seats get loose and things like that.
Carbon monoxide detectors are also important.
What's that?
Carbon monoxide detectors.
Yeah. But only if there's gas to the property or a garage, right?
Yes. If there's an attached garage or combustion appliances, newer codes, if you update, even if you have all electric heating systems and you update the electric heating system with a code permit, they'll still make you put in carbon monoxide detectors, as silly as that is. Oh. But wherever health safety is important when it comes to gas appliances and combustion.
And now they're putting arc fault outlets in bedrooms. I'm not really, what's that all about?
Arc fault circuit interrupting devices have been required in bedrooms since late 80s, early 90s. Arc fault circuit interrupters used to be breakers in the circuit breaker panel, just like the GFCIs did. The technology has recently gotten small enough that we can start putting those arc fault interrupters in bedrooms. But what that is doing is preventing overheating. If it picks up any kind of loose connection that's arcing, then it trips and loses power to that bedroom. The reason we have them in bedrooms is that's where you're going to be sleeping. So if something is overheating or arcing when you're asleep, we really want to know about it. And that helps prevent any kind of catastrophic concerns where you might be asleep and a fire starts because of it. But now we are starting to see the technology small enough that we see those little test reset buttons. Typically, you'll have it in the master bedroom in newer homes, and that'll protect all of the bedrooms around it.
Well, very cool.
Yeah.
So one of the ways to take all of this information that Dustin has just given us and get some of it off a your to-do list, I like to send an email to my property manager and ask them to send an email to my tenants. And I have one per season, or maybe about 3 of them. And they like the idea enough that I think they just now do it. But some of these things are great friendly reminders that you can email your tenants. And those might be check for secret water leaks, or ask them to do a leak check in between your walkthroughs. Ask them to keep extra furnace filters on hand so it's easy to replace, or help them do it. Remind them to put extra detector batteries on their shopping list and just have one in the house, because the only time a smoke detector battery goes out is in the middle of the night when you're sleeping. That's just how it works. It's not a real rule, but it just seems to work. And those water alarms are great, but I find that they're often also disabled after the batteries go out once. And monitoring the sprinkler system yourself, or helping the tenants, asking the tenants to help you monitor the sprinkler system to make sure you're not watering the house, because it's not actually going to get any bigger regardless of how much water you put on the house. It does not grow. And then maybe disallowing or reminding them that candles can cause fires, and that dryer vents are also a big source of forest fires. Gosh, I guess I'm just coming into forest fire season in Idaho, house fires. And then I like to remind them not to run appliances when they're not home, including fans, and to report things like sagging siding or water, and never to pour grease down the drain, since those drain clogs can also get expensive. And so it doesn't hurt to put together a little checklist of items and send it out each season. And I'm sure if you have a manager, they know to troubleshoot some items over the phone if somebody calls. But if you think you blew a fuse, it might just be your GFI outlet that needs to be reset. So that's all kind of encompassed in a friendly reminder section here. But what does anyone have any questions? Questions, comments, stories?
Well, I don't have any questions about the presentation, but I would like to talk about maybe what's the condition of rents, 1-bedroom rents these days with what's been happening.
1 bedrooms, that's the only one I didn't have on the list, and that's the one you were wondering about. Darn.
What happens?
Yeah, what 1 bedrooms have been across the board. It depends on where it is. I've seen an age and things like that. What kind of age are we talking for the rental?
Well, mine are old, but they're well maintained and they're brick.
Okay.
And the interiors are very well maintained. And as it's called the Shade Tree Apartments, and so.
Oh yeah. I think I have seen those. Yeah.
And I've got a washer and dryer in each one, and I also have free Wi-Fi.
And you're really conveniently located over by BSU.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so you've got a location bonus coming there. So while they may be older, you've got the location bonus, the walkability, the ease of getting to BSU and to downtown, and the amenities of a washer and dryer. There's off-street parking there. It's not covered, but it's off-street parking.
Correct.
And so, yeah, that's a unique mix. I would certainly think it wouldn't be below 900, but I bet you've already been getting that for a while. And I'd almost.
Well, I've always been out of the market, Stacy, because I don't have much turnover. And so I'm willing to live with, and I like it that way. But my top rent is $830.
Okay, so the number that just comes to mind for me it was 900, but then I have to remember that rents have moved beneath my feet. And so while I think I have this good gauge on things, I have to sometimes even, just add $50 onto whatever I'm thinking, because it's moving beneath my feet. But I think that if you're below 9, I think that you're unnecessarily below market rents. I think you're still in the super reasonable range if you're at that marketing version of 895 there. And there's probably even more room because of your location. I think that my instinct, without researching that specific 1 bedroom, because 1 bedrooms can be so across the board. My thought is that 895, 900 rent, you could get that even if they weren't as excellently located. So,
and I'm thinking of a $50 bump, and it shocks me to
Yeah,
to
see, that's not a huge bump anymore. That's what's crazy, especially after you were probably very gentle this past year. You
really,
probably have higher, do you have higher turnover, some BSU
I
students
have
where
no
they're,
turnover, and I rarely have BSU students.
oh, okay,
If
okay.
they do, they're always married and they're non-traditional students, because it's quiet and that's the way they
Mhm,
want it, and that's the way I want it.
mhm.
But I imagine I have a tenant that's been there for 20 years. And of course, that's one, and I keep them way under the market. I think he's at 765.
Yeah, and it's good too if you're to at least inch them up a little bit, because you start to fall behind too far, and then if you ever want to sell your building, it's
Right.
really going to start to
Yeah,
affect your value.
but you think you think that a $50 bump for somebody that's in there at 830 would accept a $50 bump for the same apartment?
I do. I absolutely do. And I think going all the way up to 895 is still in a very fair range right now, is my instinct. And I like to let them know that there's been some thought put into a rent increase if it's 50 or above. I like to say, hey, in a recent rental market evaluation, we've realized that your rent is significantly below the the market rents, and we value your long-term tenancy, and so we've determined that market rent would be, and I think 950 is well in your market rent range. And so if market rents for yours is 895 to 995, and you're bringing someone up to 895 or 875, it's just hard to argue with the fairness behind that. And then also they're going to do their own research, and so you don't want them to leave, but they're going to go looking and seeing what else they can get for 875, 85, or 895. And the answer right now is probably not too much, unfortunately. And if you're really concerned, you go ahead and do that research first and see what you could get for 895, and compare it. And if there's only one thing out there and it's either equal to yours or barely superior, that's another measuring stick on supporting your range. And if you're not doing rental increases every year, little tiny ones, if you're not just kind of bumping them up, but this is your big increase and you're not going to touch that rent again for several years, then maybe that's cause to go all the way up to the 895. Whereas if you think you're going to do small things to help keep up with market each year, then you could do your number, your 875, 885, but then do $10 next year or something like that.
Well, thank you. I have a couple of other items that I think are of similar interest with regard to COVID and and rentals and inspections and masks and social distancing. Specifically, well, and also with a change in the law with regard to evictions, and that was there's that moratorium on evictions. Then they came up with this right to jury trial for eviction. Are you seeing any terms in leases being modified, like a waiver of a jury trial in the event of an eviction in the documentation?
I'm going to have to watch that one a little more closely. I'm on the board of the Idaho Apartment Association, and I know that came up a little bit. And I remember, right now what we're really seeing is that it's not really common knowledge, this right to a jury trial, and it hasn't been practiced too much yet.
Just kind of ignore it and leave it alone for now.
Yeah, let me make a note, and I'll address that one next month, Tom, because I can't remember what we had said about that last, because it was so new, but I know that it came up in conversation, and I've got an IAA meeting tomorrow. I might be able to slip that question in and see what they're recommending. And evictions are still happening. Everybody thinks it's unfair if there's an eviction, but it's only evictions for COVID related purposes that have been thwarted. And so it has to be shown that it's a COVID hardship to prevent the eviction.
Okay. What about, I'm thinking about a new renter who might want to know, is it COVID clean? Have you done something, to clean it, like the countertops and all the touchable surfaces? Are you hearing any of activity in that area?
No, what I've done is with walkthroughs, when we need to walk through apartments, I've just asked, regardless of what you might do elsewhere, to put a mask on and to just be extra careful, and then to tell the tenants that we're being extra careful if we have to enter. And some folks don't mind, some folks do, but it seems just to make sense to be cautious if you have to enter the building, especially if it's, for showing or something like that. But I would be hesitant to take on the extra cleaning. I would just say it's been cleaned because the unit's been cleaned. But
Yeah.
for something like that, I might almost recommend if you want extra cleaning, you should do it yourself, or maybe specify what has been cleaned or how it has been cleaned.
Okay. Thank you.
But I don't think, if I'm recalling the statistics, now I'm going to get into non-technical terms, but I don't think the cooties live that long on surfaces. And so if somebody's moving in, it's probably been vacant for at least a day or two, and or probably at least a few days. And so, I don't imagine, I haven't heard of anybody catching it by moving into an apartment and just having cooties on the surface areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your questions and engagement. I appreciate it. Anyone else out there have some burning thoughts? I know we had some other questions on the rental market, and we went through some stuff, but did anyone else have any other rental market questions?
We've got a 5-bedroom up on the bench, and we haven't increased rents in 3 years. It's at $2,200, and most of the stuff, all of the appliances in the kitchen are no older than a year, and then the downstairs is not as fresh looking as the upstairs. And I've been kind of looking into maybe increasing rents, but I also really like the tenants, and they've been good. And so I don't know, I feel conflicted on I recognize like staying competitive with market rates, but also feeling like I have enough, and that all the costs are being covered with plenty on top.
And knowing what a pain in the butt a vacancy would be. You don't want to induce a vacancy, but you don't want to fall too far behind. So on your 5-bedroom, Sharika,